Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a question that feels almost impossible to ask about Hollywood. The place we thought would always be the center of the movie universe.
Right.
Why is it facing such immense challenges right now? And this comparison we're seeing everywhere, likening it to Detroit's industrial decline, is that really warranted?
It's definitely a powerful comparison. And unsettling. It's not coming out of thin air either. We've looked through all the sources you sent over the articles, research, even some personal notes from people in the industry.
Yeah.
And they paint a pretty vivid picture. Worrying in a lot of ways.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to really pull out the core insights from all that material. We want to understand the key factors, contributing to this whole situation in Hollywood. Explore the different angles the sources give us and see what they suggest about whether that Detroit comparison actually holds water. Ready to jump in?
Absolutely. And the first place our sources point us, it's the cold, hard numbers. They really do tell a story.
And right now, not a particularly cheerful one for Hollywood.
Not really, no.
They are pretty stark. That recent box office data, it shows Q1 of 2025 was down 7% compared to Q1 2024. Okay, but then the March 2025 numbers, down a full 50% from March 2024.
Yeah, 50%. That's a huge drop in just 1 month, year over year. Massive.
And that first quarter, it saw some pretty big films underperform too, right? The sources mentioned names like Betterman, Captain America, Brave New World.
Snow White, Mickey 17.
Yeah.
Not exactly the kind of performance the studios were banking on.
No. Now, Q2 did see a bit of a rebound, didn't it? The sources talk about hits like Minecraft, reportedly cleared over $900 million globally.
Right, and Sinners did pretty well domestically, though apparently weaker internationally.
And then Memorial Day weekend gave things a pop, too.
Yeah.
The live-action Lilo & Stitch remake, Mission Impossible, The Final Reckoning, big familiar names.
Big franchises, drawing crowds, yeah. Makes sense.
But here's where it gets really interesting, according to the material we've got. Through those first, 4.5 months of the year, the sources identify only one legit worldwide blockbuster and one domestic sleeper hit, and both were distributed by Warner Brothers.
Warner Brothers, yeah. Whose credit rating recently took a hit itself. That's another layer.
Right. But the really critical observation in the source material is this. None of those Q2 hits, or the Memorial Day successes, none of them were actually filmed in Hollywood.
Wow. Okay, that statistic is incredibly telling, and it leads right into another painful number from the sources. The big decline in actual production days shot on location in Los Angeles.
How big a decline?
They cite a 30% drop just over the last 5 years.
30% in 5 years.
Oh.
Wow, that's a major shift. And 2024 specifically, the sources say it saw the lowest number of shoot days in decades.
Yeah, the only year lower was 2020, when California was basically shut down with the lockdown.
Right.
And there's Film LA data that backs this up, too. It suggests only about 20% of shows made for North American audiences are actually filmed in California now.
Only 20%.
Yeah. And you couple that with the drop in Hollywood ticket sales overall, down almost 25% since 2019. And the sources see 2019 as, the last normal year before everything started shifting so dramatically.
Okay, so these numbers aren't just, dry stats on a page. The sources are saying they're fueling actual panic and anger inside the industry. It's forcing everyone to look at how big this problem really is.
Exactly. Which brings us right to the core question. Why? Why is this decline happening, and why does it seem so concentrated in Hollywood itself?
And the main argument in the material is what? That Hollywood is essentially breaking up because of itself.
Pretty much, yeah. That's the core argument presented. It points to layers and layers of bureaucracy. Corporate structures, unions, government regulations.
All contributing.
All contributing. And one source uses this phrase, hyperactivism, arguing that this activism is actually alienating customers. And all this bureaucracy, this whole complex system, the source contends it directly jacks up the cost.
Okay, so it becomes way more attractive to just film somewhere else.
Exactly. The bureaucracy isn't just annoying red tape. It's a major cost driver, pushing productions out.
Like that anecdote that popped up, I think it's on the Rob Lowe, Adam Scott podcast.
Yeah.
Saying it's cheaper to fly 100 Americans to Ireland to film than it is to shoot on the Fox lot.
Precisely that kind of thing. Or there's another example from an independent producer, Jim Agnew, mentioned on Film Thread.
Oh, yeah. He
said renting an entire courthouse in rural Kentucky for 2 days cost him $200, plus parking and security. Simple enough.
Okay, $200 seems reasonable.
Then he estimated the cost for the same kind of location in LA County, around $50,000. a day.
$50,000 a day for a courthouse. Okay, that puts the Ireland story in perspective.
Wow! It really does. And there was that Guardian article, too, with Aaron Ullman's experiences, just painting a really frustrating picture.
Right, like having to pay a third-party facilitator $2,000 just to handle the city permit.
Yeah. Or even for something seemingly simple, like a quiet interview shoot in someone's living room.
What happened?
He had to pay $1,000 for a Film LA monitor who apparently just sat there on their phone, $85 for a fire marshal who didn't even show up, and then on top of that, $900 for the permit itself.
So nearly $2,000 in fees for people who either didn't do anything or didn't show up, plus the permit cost. Ouch.
Yeah. It really highlights the perception of these excessive, costly hurdles and the source we're drawing from here.
Well, it sounds pretty skeptical about how quickly any government efforts can actually fix.
They mentioned LA Mayor Karen Bass directing departments to cut red tape.
They did, but then they immediately made this rather cynical comparison to how effectively the Palisades fire was handled. Sort of implies, don't hold your breath. That's a tough comparison. Yeah. Understood. Yet, despite that kind of criticism floating around in the sources, they also note that both Mayor Bath and Governor Newsom are still, widely supported by most people in the film industry.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic they point out. And Governor Newsom has proposed boosting California's film and TV tax credit program in a big way.
How big?
More than doubling it, from $330 million up to $750 million.
Okay, that's a significant increase.
Definitely. And there's a push from workers, too. That Guardian piece mentioned a coalition of Hollywood workers advocating to raise the actual tax credit rate from 20% up to 35%.
So more money, higher rate. Sounds like what you'd expect.
It does, but our main source offers a pretty sharp critique of California's current incentive program. Argues it's actually part of the problem, the way it's structured.
Really? How so?
Yeah.
What are the issues with the existing program, according to this source?
Well, the biggest one they hammer home is that above the line costs, salaries for the big stars, directors, top producers. They aren't eligible for the rebates or incentives in California.
Oh, okay. So the biggest budget items don't get the credit.
Exactly. Plus, apparently, the system for even getting the incentives that are available, it's a lottery. It's not guaranteed.
A lottery? Seriously?
Yeah. So the source argues these two things, no above-the-line credits and the lottery system, make California way less competitive, especially compared to other states or even countries that do offer credits on those big salaries and have more predictable systems.
And is that why the source is so pessimistic?
Yeah.
Why they believe production will, quote, never return to California in a big way?
Yeah.
Because that lack of above-the-line incentive is just too big a hurdle.
That's their strong assertion, yeah. It's a big one, as they put it. And they also suggest that even if the overall pot of tax credit money is increased, it might come bundled with what the source calls strings attached, like maybe a specific jobs formula you have to meet, or requirements about, things like gender-neutral bathrooms and land acknowledgments.
Okay, gender-neutral bathrooms and land acknowledgments tied to tax credits. That's a very specific combination.
It definitely raises eyebrows in the source material. It ties into this broader discussion they bring up about DEI initiatives.
How so?
Well, the material mentions reports from places like Variety and UCLA suggesting that despite all the commitments made a few years ago, Hollywood has actually been seen as moving backwards on diversity metrics recently.
Backwards.
Yeah, and they mentioned this happening particularly amid perceived hostility from the Trump administration. But now there are actual California regulations coming into effect July 1st.
Okay, what do they say?
They will require productions getting state tax incentives to show they're hiring diversely, both on screen and behind the camera. And they also suggest providing gender-neutral bathrooms and issuing land acknowledgments on set, to honor the native tribes whose land the production is in.
Okay, so the regulations require diversity hiring, but suggest the bathrooms and land acknowledgement.
That seems to be the distinction, yes. But the source clearly sees these specific requirements, especially the land acknowledgement suggestion, as examples of that hyperactivism they think is problematic.
Got it. They see it as another layer of government, adding complex, maybe politically charged requirements.
Exactly. And their critique sort of comes full circle here. They point out the irony as they see it. The industry is asking for help, for more money from the very government officials who they argue presided over the problems developing in the first place. Especially since, as the source notes, the industry consistently votes these same officials back into office. It's presented as this kind of self-inflicted cycle.
Okay, so we've covered bureaucracy, costs, permits, tax incentives, policy angles. What about the entertainment unions? Where do they fit into this picture, according to the sources?
Well, the source we're focusing on describes the unions as another significant factor, another source of what they term hyperactivism regulations and quotas that, again, they argue drive up costs.
So the contention is that rising labor costs pushed by unions, are also contributing to productions leaving.
That's the argument, yes. That it contributes to pushing productions overseas or just to other states with lower labor costs or different rules.
But the sources also mention pushback on that idea, right? Like from the Screen Actors Guild.
That's important, yeah. The sources do include that counterpoint. Union leaders, like a spokesperson for SAG-AFTRA, are quoted pushing back hard against the idea that the gains workers made in the 2023 strikes are somehow responsible for the recent drop in LA production. They reject that link.
Okay, so there's definitely disagreement there within the material itself. But that Jim Agnew anecdote about union rule, that seems designed to highlight the perception of rigid, costly practices, doesn't it?
It does.
Like needing a whole separate person paid $350 a day just to be the one who pushes a button to make haze on set.
Yeah, that anecdote is definitely used by the source to illustrate what they see as like excessive staffing requirements or overly rigid work rules that contribute to the high-cost structure in LA.
And the source presents some pretty tough data on how union members themselves are faring through all that.
Very tough. They look at the Writers Guild, the WGA, for instance. Out of about 12,000 members, historically, only about half of them typically made over $45,000 a year.
Which is the threshold needed for health insurance, right?
Exactly. But now, after this recent industry contraction, the source estimates that number that the writers consistently working and earning enough for health insurance is down to only around 3,500 members.
Wow. From maybe 6,000 down to 3,500. That's a brutal drop in the number of writers making a consistent living wage.
It really is. And for union members across the board who are still working, the source claims their earnings have plunged 32%.
A third less.
Yeah. The source also brings in a quote from Rebecca Ryan, who's the executive director of the Directors Guild of America. She suggested Hollywood maybe took a little bit for granted its homegrown industry, that it lacked foresight.
Acknowledging a bit of complacency, maybe?
Perhaps. And the source then takes that critique and applies it more broadly, arguing it fits all the entertainment unions. They contend that the actions taken by unions post-strike ultimately led to this contraction, to outsourcing, to reduced production levels, massive layoffs, and critically, in their view, it cleared a path for AI.
Whoa, that's a heavy charge. That the very efforts meant to protect workers might have, maybe inadvertently, sped up job losses and even opened the door wider for AI, undermining the members they represent.
It's definitely a harsh viewpoint presented in the source, directly linking union actions not just to the current struggles, but also to the future challenge from AI.
And this all loops back, the source argues, to the audience, because these internal factors, the bureaucracy, the costs, the policies, the union dynamics, this perceived hyperactivism, it's all seen as alienating the paying customer.
Exactly. It's not just about the mechanics of how movies get made or where they get made. The source argues there's a growing cultural disconnect with the audience that's causing serious brand damage.
Brand damage. Okay, so the source believes that while the industry might blame external factors, the global market shrinking, studios pulling back from those huge streaming wars budgets, economic uncertainty.
Right, all those things are happening, sure.
But the real truth, according to this source, is internal brand damage. And their claim is that audience tolerance for the message, whatever people perceive that message to be, has just completely evaporated.
That's the core claim, yes. That the audience has just had enough of feeling lectured to or alienated by the content or the creators.
And this leads to the source's rather dramatic framing. This tale of two dying Hollywoods. What's that about?
Yeah, they draw the stark contrast. On one side, they put what they call classic Hollywood, and their prime example is Tom.
Okay, Tom Cruise. How so?
They point to his whole approach. He's out there actively promoting his films, doing these insane stunts himself, engaging directly with fans, very publicly thanking the audience for showing up and supporting the movies. It's presented as the model that works. It brings people in.
Right. Makes sense. And the other side of this tale?
They label that side dying woke Hollywood. And this side, in the source's view, is exemplified by things like certain discussions happening at festivals like Cannes, or by figures like Pedro Pascal.
Pedro Pascal specifically. Why him?
The source specifically claims people like him, through their perceived political statements, or maybe the specific messaging in the projects they choose, actually drive customers away.
So the argument is, Hollywood has this model that works the Tom Cruise approach of focusing on entertainment, spectacle, and appreciating the audience. But instead, it's embracing this other approach.
An approach exemplified by Cannes discussions or figures like Pascal,
which the source argues is actively pushing customers away and causing this major brand damage.
That's precisely the distinction the source makes. They attribute a huge part of the industry's current problems to this perceived disconnect and the audience alienation that results from it.
Okay, so you put all these pieces together, the layers of bureaucracy, the crazy high costs made worse by regulations and maybe some union rules, the tax incentives that aren't competitive, according to the source, and this huge issue of brand damage.
Right, all those internal factors.
The source arrives at a pretty definitive and honestly pretty pessimistic conclusion about where Hollywood is headed.
Extremely pessimistic. Their conclusion is basically that Hollywood will never learn, that it's past the point of no return.
Wow. Not just becoming the new Detroit, but maybe worse.
That's what they argue. The source believes Hollywood isn't just becoming the new Detroit, it's actually well on its way to surpassing it. They even predict a future where people warn about becoming the next Hollywood. Like, that becomes the cautionary tale.
Oof, that comparison is incredibly powerful and grim. You think about Detroit's industrial core just hollowing out, and the source is saying Hollywood's on a similar, maybe even faster track.
That's the trajectory they see. They envision a future where the entertainment industry is much more spread out, decentralized, or at least semi-decentralized. Productions happening in various places that offer better incentives and, fewer of these perceived hurdles.
Makes sense if the costs and bureaucracy are that bad in L.A.
And the source concludes this whole section with a really stark statement, putting the blame squarely internal. Hollywood wasn't murdered, they're right. It committed suicide.
Wow. Okay. That's a powerful final word from the source material on that. Very clearly saying that the problems are self-inflicted, not just external forces acting upon it.
It definitely pulls all those complex threads together, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The sheer cost and difficulty blamed on bureaucracy, corporate, government, union levels. The incentive structures seem as non-competitive. The impact of union dynamics as viewed by this source. And then this huge overlay of perceived brand damage pushing the audience away.
So when we look at the whole picture painted by these sources, yes, there are economic pressures, but they're viewed mostly through this lens of self-inflicted wounds. Policy choices, labor stuff, cultural shifts. It's really multifaceted.
It truly is. And this whole idea of the industry breaking up or decentralizing, it isn't just some theoretical business school discussion, right?
No, absolutely not. Because ultimately, for you, the listener, it raises some really fascinating and important questions, doesn't it?
Considering all these forces, the sources highlight the internal stuff, the external pressures. What does this potential shift actually mean for the kinds of stories that get told in the future? Where are those stories going to be made? And maybe most directly, what does it mean for what you will actually see available to watch on your screens down the line? It's a really complex picture with a lot of moving parts, isn't it?